Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. On December 1st, 1948, at 6:30 a.m., police were contacted after a couple discovered the body of a man on Somerton Park Beach near Glenelg, southwest of Adelaide in South Australia, where he was found lying in the sand across from the crippled children's home at the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace, positioned on his back with his head resting against the seawall, his legs stretched out before him, and his feet neatly crossed, giving the initial impression that he had simply fallen asleep and never woken again. A half-smoked cigarette rested on the right collar of his coat, and when officers searched his pockets, they found an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a city bus ticket that may never have been used, a narrow aluminium cone manufactured in the United States, a half-empty packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet containing 7 cigarettes of a different brand known as Kinsitas, and a quarter-full box of Bryant & May matches, all of which offered no immediate explanation for his presence or death. While witnesses later told police that on the evening of November 30th, they had seen a man matching the deceased lying in the same spot where the body was later found, with one couple observing him around 7 p.m. and noticing that he briefly extended his right arm to its fullest reach before letting it fall limply to his side, and another couple watching him between 7:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. after the streetlights came on, during which time they did not see him move at all and only had the vague sense that his position may have shifted slightly, though they found it strange that he showed no reaction to the mosquitoes and ultimately assumed he was either drunk or asleep and chose not to interfere, while one witness recalled seeing a man standing at the top of the steps leading down to the beach, looking down at the figure in the sand. And all witnesses agreed that the man's body was in the same position when police later arrived and examined the scene. Another witness came forward in 1959 and told police that he and 3 others had seen a well-dressed man carrying another man on his shoulders along Somerton Park Beach on the night before the body was discovered, a sighting that was formally recorded in a police report by Detective Don O'Doherty, and according to the pathologist John Burton Cleland, the deceased was of what he described as Britisher appearance and was believed to be around 40 to 45 years of age, in excellent physical condition, standing approximately 180 centimeters tall with gray eyes and fair to ginger-colored hair that showed slight graying around the temples, a build marked by broad shoulders and a narrow waist, hands and fingernails that showed no signs of manual labor, toes that met in a distinctive wedge shape similar to those of a dancer or someone accustomed to wearing pointed boots, and notably well-developed calf muscles consistent with people who regularly wore boots, high-heeled footwear, or engaged in ballet, while his clothing consisted of a white shirt, a red, white, and blue tie, brown trousers with socks and shoes, a brown knitted pullover, and a fashionable gray and brown double-breasted jacket said to be of American tailoring. Yet all identifying labels have been carefully removed. He wore no hat, which was unusual for the time, carried no wallet, was clean-shaven, and had no form of identification on him, leading police to initially believe his death may have been a suicide, a theory further complicated by the fact that his dental records could not be matched to any known individual. An autopsy was carried out, and the pathologist estimated that the man had died at around 2 in the morning on December 1st, noting that his heart was of normal size and appeared normal in every respect, while small vessels not commonly seen in the brain were clearly visible and congested. The pharynx showed signs of congestion, and the gullet was coated with a whitening of the superficial mucosal layers with a distinct patch of ulceration at its center, as the stomach itself was deeply congested and contained food mixed with blood, with further congestion observed in the latter portion of the duodenum, while both kidneys were congested and the liver held an excessive amount of blood within its vessels, and the spleen was described as strikingly enlarged, measuring roughly 3 times its usual size, with microscopic examination revealing destruction in the central areas of the liver lobules, alongside findings of acute hemorrhagic gastritis, extensive congestion of both the liver and spleen, and significant congestion of the brain. And although the autopsy determined that the man's final meal had been a pasty consumed roughly 3 to 4 hours before his death, all tests failed to detect any foreign substance within his body, leading the pathologist John Dwyer to state that he was firmly convinced the death could not have been natural and that the poison he suspected was likely a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic, yet despite poisoning remaining the primary theory, the pasty itself was not believed to be the source. And beyond this, the coroner was unable to reach any definitive conclusion regarding the man's identity or exact cause of death, nor could it be confirmed whether the man seen alive on Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30th was the same individual, as no one had clearly seen his face at that time, after which the body was embalmed on December 10th. 1948, when police failed to obtain a positive identification, an action they stated was the first time they had known such a measure to be necessary. That on January 14, 1949, staff at the Adelaide railway station discovered a brown suitcase with its identifying label removed, which had been checked into the station cloakroom shortly after 11 in the morning on November 30th, 1948. And it was widely believed that the suitcase belonged to the unidentified man later found dead on Somerton Park Beach, as inside were personal items that painted a partial picture of his life, including a red check dressing gown, a pair of red felt slippers in size 7, for pairs of underpants, pajamas, and various shaving items, along with a light brown pair of trousers that still had sand trapped in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife that had been cut down into a short, sharp instrument, a pair of scissors with their points sharpened, a small square of zinc thought to have served as a protective sheath for the knife and scissors, and a stenciling brush of the kind used by third officers on merchant ships to stencil cargo, while further examination revealed a thread card of Barber brand orange wax thread of an unusual type not available in Australia, which matched the same thread used to repair the lining of a pocket in the trousers the man had been wearing when his body was found. And although all identification marks had been removed from the clothing, police did uncover the name T. Keane on a tie, Keane on a laundry bag, and Keane on a singlet, along with 3 dry cleaning marks reading 1171/7, 4393/7, and 3053/7, leading investigators to believe that whoever had removed the clothing labels had either overlooked these items or deliberately left the Keane markings behind, confident that Keane was not the dead man's true name. With wartime rationing still in effect, clothing was difficult to obtain during that period. And while the use of name tags on garments was extremely common, it was equally common for people who bought second-hand clothing to remove the previous owner's tags. Yet what investigators found unusual was that there were no spare socks in the suitcase and no letters or personal correspondence of any kind, despite the presence of pencils and unused writing paper, and a thorough search later confirmed that no individual named T. Keane was reported missing in any English-speaking country, while a nationwide circulation of the dry cleaning marks also produced no results, leaving investigators with little more than the observation that the front gusset and feather stitching on a coat found in the case indicated it had been manufactured in the United States, a coat that had not been imported, suggesting that the man had either traveled to America himself or had acquired it from someone of similar build who had, as police continued their investigation by reviewing incoming train records and concluded that he most likely arrived at the Adelaide railway station on an overnight train from Melbourne, Sydney, or Port Augusta, and they speculated that upon arrival he may have showered and shaved at the nearby city baths, despite the absence of any baths ticket on his body, before returning to the station to purchase a ticket for the 10:50 a.m. train to Henley Beach, a train he never boarded for unknown reasons, after which he checked his suitcase into the station cloakroom, left the station, and boarded a city bus to Glenelg, while it was later clarified that despite the name, the city baths were not a public bathing facility, but a public swimming pool, with the railway station's bathing facilities located adjacent to the cloakroom near the station's southern exit onto North Terrace. and the city baths on King William Street access from the northern exit via a laneway, with no record indicating that the station's bathroom facilities were unavailable on the day the man arrived. An inquest into the man's death, overseen by coroner Thomas Erskine Cleland, began just a few days after the body was discovered, but was adjourned and reconvened on June 17, 1949, during which Cleland, acting as the investigating pathologist, re-examined the body and made several noteworthy observations, including that the man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been recently polished, a condition inconsistent with someone who had supposedly been wandering around Glenelg throughout the day, which in turn lent weight to the theory that the body may have been placed at Somerton Park Beach after death, potentially explaining the absence of vomiting and convulsions, the two primary physiological responses expected in cases of poisoning. While Cleland also speculated that because none of the witnesses could definitively confirm that the individual they had seen the previous night was the same man found the next morning, it remained possible that he had died elsewhere and been transported to the beach. A line of reasoning he stressed was purely speculative, given that all witnesses were adamant it was definitely the same person, as the body had been found in the identical location and in the same distinctive posture. And despite this scrutiny, Cleland was unable to uncover any evidence that would reveal the identity of the deceased. Cedric Stanton Hicks, a professor of physiology and pharmacology at the University of Adelaide, gave testimony explaining that within a particular group of drugs, which he labeled number 1, and specifically a variant he called number 2, even a relatively small oral dose could be extremely toxic while remaining incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to detect. And he provided Coroner Cleland with a piece of paper listing the names of these 2 drugs, which was entered into evidence as Exhibit C.18, though their identities were not made public until the 1980s because at the time they were quite easily procurable by the ordinary individual from a chemist without any justification for purchase. These drugs were later identified as digitalis and wabin, both cardinalide-type cardiac glycosides, and Hicks noted that the only fact missing from the case was any evidence of vomiting, though he cautioned that its absence did not preclude poisoning and that he could not draw a completely definitive conclusion without it, further stating that if death had occurred roughly 7 hours after the man was last seen moving, it would imply a massive dose that still might have gone undetected, and it was suggested that the movement observed by witnesses at 7 p.m. could have represented the last convulsion before death. While early in the inquiry, Cleland remarked that he would be prepared to find that he died from poison, that the poison was probably a glucoside, and that it was not accidentally administered. Yet he could not determine whether it had been self-administered or given by another individual, leaving the cause of death unresolved. And he added that if the body had indeed been transported to its final location on Somerton Park Beach, all the difficulties would disappear, highlighting the enduring mystery surrounding the unidentified man's demise. After the inquest, authorities had a plaster cast made of the man's head and shoulders. Yet the continued failure to determine both his identity and the cause of death led officials to label the case an unparalleled mystery, with many believing that the truth behind his demise might never be uncovered. And around the same time, a tiny rolled-up piece of paper bearing the words "Tamam should" was discovered in a fob pocket sewn inside the deceased's trouser pocket, a phrase which public library officials identified as meaning ended or finished, taken from the final page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, with the reverse side of the paper left completely blank, prompting police to launch a nationwide search for a copy of the book that matched this unusual feature, and a photograph of the scrap of paper was released to the press to aid in the investigation, ultimately resulting in the discovery of the specific book from which the page had been torn, a 1941 edition of Edward Fitzgerald's 1859 translation of the Rubaiyat, published by Whitcomb and Toombs in Christchurch, New Zealand. And while Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, who led the initial inquiry, typically protected the identities of witnesses by using pseudonyms, he referred to the man who produced the book as Ronald Francis, whose real identity was never officially confirmed. And it emerged that Francis had only realized the possible connection of the book to the case after seeing a newspaper article the previous day having given the book to police in response to their public appeal. There remains some uncertainty about the exact circumstances under which the Rubaiyat was discovered, as one newspaper reported that the book was found a week or two before the body was discovered on Somerton Park Beach, while former South Australian Police Detective Jerry Feltis, who later investigated the case as a cold file, stated that the book was found just after that man was found on the beach. A timing that carries significance because, based on the evidence from the suitcase, the man is presumed to have arrived in Adelaide only the day before his body was found, meaning that if the book had been discovered a week or two earlier, it could imply he had previously visited or spent more time in the city than previously believed, with most accounts agreeing that the book was found in an open-roof car parked on Jetty Road in Glenelg, either in the rear floor well or on the back seat, and the theme of the Rubaiyat, emphasizing living life to the fullest and having no regrets when it ends, led police to theorize that the man may have committed suicide by poison, although no other evidence supported this idea, with the book missing the words Tamam should from its final page, the reverse side blank, and microscopic analysis confirming that the scrap of paper found in the man's pocket had been torn from this exact page. While on the back of the book, faint indentations revealed 5 lines of text written in capital letters, with the second line struck out, a detail considered significant because of its similarity to the 4th line and the possibility that it represented an error in encryption, forming a cryptic sequence reading W. Rigobab, M-L-I-O-I, Tbimpinip, followed by an X, and then Mliabo AIQC, Itn Samskab. Though in the first line, it is unclear whether the initial letter is an M or W, with W generally favored based on comparison to the struck out M. The second line appears as Mliawi with its last character resembling an L, but on closer inspection, being an I combined with the extended line used to strike out or underline the text. And the other L in the code has a distinctive curve at the bottom, while the significance of the X above the last O in the code remains unknown, leaving the enigmatic writing a tantalizing and unresolved piece of the mystery surrounding the Somerton man initially. The mysterious letters found in the Rubaiyat were believed to be words in a foreign language until investigators realized they were actually a code, prompting authorities to call in professional code breakers, though their efforts to decipher the lines proved unsuccessful, and even amateurs who attempted to crack it were unable to find a solution. And then in 1978, at the request of ABC television journalist Stuart Littlemore, cryptographers from the Department of Defense analyzed the handwritten text, but reported that it was impossible to provide a satisfactory answer, because if the text was indeed an encrypted message, its extreme brevity meant there were insufficient symbols from which any clear meaning could be extracted, adding that the sequence could just as easily be the meaningless creation of a disturbed mind. While in 2004, retired detective Jerry Feltis speculated in a Sunday Mail article that the final line, Itn Samskab, might represent the initials for a sentence reading, "It's time to move to South Australia, Mosley Street," referencing Jessica Thompson, who lived on Mosley Street, the main road, through Glenelg. And then between 2009 and 2011, Derek Abbott and his team concluded that it was most probable that each letter represented the first letter of a word, with a 2014 computational analysis by linguist John Relling strongly supporting the theory that the letters were likely initials of some English text, though he found no match in an extensive survey of literature and concluded that the letters were probably written as a form of shorthand rather than a traditional code, meaning that the original text behind them is very likely lost to history and may never be definitively determined. That a telephone number was discovered in the back of the Rubaiyat, which belonged to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Jo Thompson, 1921 to 2007. Born Jesse Harkness in Marrickville, Sydney, New South Wales, who lived on Mosley Street in Glenelg, roughly 400 meters north of where the Somerton man's body was found. And when police interviewed her, Thompson stated that she did not know the deceased and had no idea why he would have had her phone number or chosen to visit her suburb on the night of his death, though she also recalled that sometime in late 1948, an unidentified man had tried to visit her and had asked a next-door neighbor about her. While in his book on the case, retired detective Jerry Feltis wrote that during an interview with Thompson in 2002, she appeared either evasive or simply unwilling to discuss the matter, leading him to believe that she actually knew the Somerton man's identity, a suspicion echoed years later by Thompson's daughter, Kate, who in a 2014 television interview on Channel 9's 60 Minutes said she believed her mother had known the dead man. And in 1949, Jessica Thompson requested that police not keep a permanent record of her name or release her details to third parties, fearing it would be embarrassing and damaging to her reputation if linked to the case. A request police honored, though this decision later complicated investigations. While in media coverage, books, and discussions of the case, she was often referred to by pseudonyms such as Justin or Teresa Johnson A. Powell, and although Feltus claimed in 2010 that he had permission from Thompson's family to disclose her and her husband Prosper Thompson's real names, he used pseudonyms in his book and agreed not to reveal her identity, noting that her true name might be crucial because it could potentially serve as a key to deciphering the mysterious code. Found in the book, when shown the plaster cast bust of the Somerton man by Detective Sergeant Lean, Jessica Thompson stated that she could not identify the person depicted, though Lean later described her reaction as being completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint, and Paul Lawson, the technician who had created the cast and was present during her viewing, recalled that after briefly glancing at the bust, Thompson immediately looked away and refused to look at it. Again, while she also revealed that during World War II, while working at Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, she had owned a copy of the Rubaiyat, which she had, in 1945 at the Clifton Gardens Hotel in Sydney, given to an Australian Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall, who was serving in the water transport section of the Royal Australian Engineers at the time. And Thompson told police that after the war she had moved to Melbourne, married, and had received a letter from Boxall, to which she replied explaining that she was now married. Though subsequent research indicates that her future husband, Prosper Thompson, was still in the process of obtaining a divorce from his first wife in 1949 and did not marry Jessica until mid-1950. And there is no evidence that Boxall had any further contact with Jessica Thompson after 1945. As a result of their discussions with Jessica Thompson, police initially suspected that Alf Boxall might be the Somerton man, but in July 1949 Boxall was located in Sydney, and the final page of his copy of the Rubaiyat, reportedly in 1924 Sydney edition, remained intact with the words Tamam should still present, and Boxall, who was then working in the maintenance section at the Randwick Bus Depot, where he had been employed prior to the war, had no knowledge of any connection between himself and the deceased. While on the front of the copy of the Rubaiyat that Thompson had given him, she had signed herself as Justin and inscribed verse 70, which read, Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before / I swore. But was I sober when I swore? / and then came spring, and rose in hand / my threadbare penitence 8 pieces tore. And in the media, coverage of the case varied, with Adelaide's 2 daily newspapers taking different approaches. The Advertiser first mentioned the discovery on page 3 of its morning edition on December 2nd, 1948, under the headline Body Found on Beach, reporting that the body, believed to be that of E.C. Johnson, about 45 of Arthur Street, Payneham, had been found opposite the crippled Children's home the previous morning by Mr. J. Lyons of White Road, Somerton, while Detective H. Strangway and Constable J. Moss were investigating, whereas the news ran a more detailed story on its front page, and by June 1949, one journalist noted, alluding to the line in the Rubaiyat, that the Somerton man seems to have made certain that the glass would be empty, save for speculation, with an editorial describing the case as one of Australia's most profound mysteries, and suggesting that if the man had indeed died from a poison so rare and obscure that even toxicology experts could not identify it, then the advanced knowledge required to obtain such a substance implied a level of sophistication far beyond a simple domestic poisoning. Over the years, a number of possible identifications of the Somerton man were proposed, beginning almost immediately after the discovery of his body. On December 3rd, 1948, a day after the Advertiser had named him as the likely victim, a man named E.C. Johnson presented himself at a police station. While that same day, the News published a front-page photograph of the deceased, prompting further public tips and calls about his possible identity. Yet by December 4th, authorities announced that the man's fingerprints were not on file in South Australia, forcing them to expand their search beyond the state. And on December 5th, the Advertiser reported that police were examining military records after a man claimed to have shared a drink with someone resembling the deceased at a Glenelg hotel on November 13th, during which the mystery man had reportedly produced a military pension card in the name of Solomonson. And in early January 1949, two people identified the body as that of 63-year-old former woodcutter Robert Walsh, while a third person, James Mack, initially could not confirm the identification but later contacted police to claim it was Walsh, explaining that the initial hesitation was due to a difference in hair color, as Walsh had left Adelaide several months earlier to buy sheep in Queensland and had not returned for Christmas as expected. Yet police were skeptical, believing Walsh to be too old to match the dead man, although they noted that the body's hands were consistent with someone who had been a woodcutter, even if he had not worked at the trade for at least 18 months, and any notion that a positive identification had been achieved was ultimately overturned when Elizabeth Thompson, one of the original identifiers, retracted her statement after a second viewing revealed the absence of a distinctive scar and the relative size of the man's legs, convincing her that the deceased was not Robert Walsh. By early February 1949, there had already been 8 separate positive identifications of the Somerton man, including 2 men from Darwin who believed the body was that of a friend, as well as others who thought he might have been a missing station worker, a steamship employee, or a Swedish national. While detectives from Victoria initially suspected the man was from their state due to the similarity of the laundry marks on his clothing to those used by several Melbourne dry cleaning firms. And following publication of his photograph in Victoria, 28 people came forward claiming to know his identity. Yet all claims were subsequently disproven by Victoria detectives, who also indicated that other investigations made it unlikely the deceased had any connection to the state, while a seaman named Tommy Reed, who was serving on the SS Cycle and had been in port at the time, was initially considered a possible match. But after some of his shipmates examined the body at the morgue, they categorically stated that the corpse was not Reed, and by November 1953, police revealed that they had received their 251st alleged identification of the body from members of the public claiming to have met or known him, though authorities concluded that the only clue of any real value remained the clothing the man had been wearing at the time of his death. Contemporary reports noted a possible connection between the Somerton man case and the tragic death of a 2-year-old boy 6 months later, when on June 6, 1949, the body of Clive Magnuson was discovered in a sack in the large Bay Sand Hills, approximately 20 kilometers north of Somerton Park, lying beside his unconscious father, Keith Waldemar Magnuson, who was found in a severely weakened state from exposure and was subsequently transferred to a mental hospital following a medical examination. While the Magnusons had been missing for 4 days and authorities estimated that Clive had been dead for roughly 24 hours when discovered, the scene located by a man named Neil McRae of Large Bay, who claimed he had been guided to the location in a dream the previous night. And although the coroner could not determine a definitive cause of death for the young boy, natural causes were considered unlikely, leading the contents of his stomach to be sent to a government analyst for further testing. And following these events, Clive's mother, Roma Magnuson, reported that she had been threatened by a masked man driving a battered cream-colored car, who nearly ran her down outside her home on Cheapside Street in Largs North, stopping to warn her with the words, "Keep away from the police or else." While she also noted that a similar-looking man had been observed lurking near the house recently, and she believed these incidents might be connected to her husband's investigation into the Somerton man, whom he had suspected might be Carl Thompson, a man he had worked with in Renmark in 1939, though soon after reporting this harassment to police, Roma Magnuson collapsed and required medical attention herself. J.M. Gower, secretary of the Largs North Progress Association, received anonymous phone calls warning that Mrs. Magnuson would suffer an accident if he became involved, while H. Curtis, the acting mayor of Port Adelaide, received 3 similar anonymous calls threatening an accident should he stick his nose into the Magnuson affair. Though police suspected the calls were a hoax and may have come from the same individual who had recently terrorized a woman in a nearby suburb who had lost her husband under tragic circumstances. And beyond the intense public attention in Australia during the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Somerton Man case also drew international interest, with South Australia police consulting counterparts overseas and distributing information about the deceased in an effort to identify him. Yet despite worldwide circulation of his photograph and fingerprint details, no positive identification was made, and agencies such as the FBI in the United States were unable to match the fingerprints with any domestic criminal records, while Scotland Yard was also asked for assistance but could provide no additional insights, leaving the man's identity a mystery even on a global scale. In 1949, the unidentified man was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, with a funeral service conducted by the Salvation Army and funded by the South Australian Grandstand Bookmakers Association to prevent a pauper's burial. And in the years following his interment, flowers began appearing on the grave, prompting police to question a woman seen leaving the cemetery. Though she claimed to know nothing about the deceased, while around the same time, Ina Harvey, a receptionist at the Strathmore Hotel opposite Adelaide Railway Station, reported that a strange man had stayed in room 21 or 23 for several days around the time of the man's death, checking out on November 30th, 1948, describing him as English-speaking and carrying only a small black case, similar to one a musician or doctor might use. And she recalled that when an employee peeked inside, the man indicated he had found an object resembling a needle inside, and on November 22, 1959, it was reported that an inmate of New Zealand's Whanganui prison, E.B. Collins, claimed to know the dead man's identity, while in 1978 ABC TV produced a documentary titled The Somerton Beach Mystery for its Inside Story series, in which reporter Stuart Littlemore investigated the case, interviewing Alf Boxall, who could offer no new information, and Paul Lawson, the technician who made the plaster cast, who refused to answer whether anyone had positively identified the body. And in 1994, John Harbour Phillips, Chief Justice of Victoria and Chairman of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, conducted a review of the case to determine the cause of death, concluding that there seems little doubt it was digitalis, citing evidence such as engorged organs consistent with digitalis poisoning, the absence of any natural disease, and the absence of anything seen macroscopically which could account for the death, thereby lending strong forensic support to the long-held suspicion that the Somerton Man had died from a rare and undetectable cardiac glycoside. Former South Australian Chief Superintendent Len Brown, who had worked on the case during the 1940s, later stated that he believed the Somerton Man originated from a country within the Warsaw Pact, a theory that contributed to the persistent inability of police to confirm his identity. While today the South Australian Police Historical Society retains the plaster bust of the man, which still contains strands of his hair, though further attempts to identify him have been severely limited by the fact that embalming with formaldehyde destroyed much of his DNA and other critical evidence, including the brown suitcase, was destroyed in 1986, with many original witness statements also lost from the police files over the decades, and speculation about the man's identity has remained intense, particularly the theory that he may have been a spy, given the unusual circumstances of his death and the historical context, with at least two locations near Adelaide, the Radium Hill uranium mine and the Woomera Test Range, an Anglo-Australian military research facility, being sites of potential interest to intelligence agents, while his death occurred during a period of reorganization of Australian security agencies that would culminate in the establishment of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ISDO, the following year, followed by a crackdown on Soviet espionage revealed later through intercepted communications under the Venona Project, leaving room for continued intrigue over whether the mysterious man was involved in covert activities at the height of early Cold War tensions. Another line of speculation has centered on Alf Boxall, who was reportedly involved in intelligence work during and immediately after World War II, and in a 1978 television interview, journalist Stuart Littlemore asked Boxall whether he had discussed his intelligence work with Jessica Harkness, to which Boxall replied no, and added that Harkness could only have known about it if someone else had told her. while in little more suggested the possibility of an espionage connection to the Somerton man in Adelaide. Boxall dismissed it as quite a melodramatic thesis, though Boxall's Army service record indicates he initially served in the 4th Water Transport Company before being seconded to the North Australia Observer Unit, an AOU, a Special Operations Unit, and that during his time with an AOU, he was rapidly promoted from Lance Corporal to Lieutenant within 3 months, highlighting his unusually fast rise in rank and involvement in sensitive operations. While in 2011, a separate theory was proposed when an Adelaide woman contacted biological anthropologist Mache Henneberg about an identification card belonging to an H.C. Reynolds, which had been found among her father's possessions and issued in the United States on February 28, 1918, to foreign seamen during World War I, showing Reynolds as British and 18 years old. Henneberg compared the photograph on the card to images of the Somerton man and found anatomical similarities in the nose, lips, and eyes, though he considered the ear shape to be a far more reliable match, noting a very good similarity and identifying a unique mole on the cheek that was present in the same shape and position in both photographs, leading him to conclude that together with the similarity of the ear characteristics, this mole, in a forensic case, would allow me to make a rare statement positively identifying the Somerton man. Yet searches by the U.S. National Archives, the UK National Archives, and the Australian War Memorial Research Centre found no additional records relating to H.C. Reynolds, and while the South Australia Police Major Crime Branch, which still lists the case as open, has indicated they will investigate this new lead, some independent researchers suggest that the car may have belonged to Horace Charles Reynolds, a Tasmanian man who died in 1953 and therefore could not have been the Somerton man, leaving the theory intriguing but inconclusive. Prosper Thompson passed away in 1995 and Jessica Thompson in 2007. And in November 2013, 3 of their relatives spoke to Channel 9's 60 Minutes about the Somerton man case, with Kate Thompson, the daughter of Jessica and Prosper, revealing that her mother had been the woman interviewed by police decades earlier and had admitted to her that she had lied during those interviews, claiming that she did know the Somerton man's identity and that it was known to a level higher than the police force. While Kate also suggested that her mother and the Somerton man may have both been involved in espionage, noting that Jessica had taught English to migrants, had an interest in communism, and could speak Russian, though she never explained where or why she had acquired the language. Additionally, Roma Egan, the widow of Jessica's son Robin and their daughter Rachel Egan, also appeared on 60 Minutes, proposing that the Somerton man might have been Robin's father and Rachel's grandfather, and they reported submitting a new application to Attorney General John Rao to have the Somerton man's body exhumed for DNA testing, with University of Adelaide professor Derek Abbott supporting the request on the grounds that exhumation for DNA identification aligned with federal policy for identifying soldiers in war graves to provide closure to families. Though Kate Thompson opposed the exhumation, viewing it as disrespectful to her brother. Interest in exhuming the Somerton man's remains have been considered for decades, and in October 2011, when renewed public curiosity emerged, Attorney General John Rao refused to permit exhumation, stating that there needed to be reasons extending beyond mere public curiosity or broad scientific interest. While former investigator Jerry Feltus noted that although he was still being contacted by people in Europe who believed the man might have been a missing relative, he did not think that exhumation or tracing the man's family connections would provide definitive answers, as during that period so many individuals, including alleged war criminals, had changed their names and relocated to other countries, making any potential identification extraordinarily complex. However, in October 2019, Attorney General Vicky Chapman granted approval for the exhumation to extract DNA for analysis, with the interested parties agreeing to cover the costs, and plans were made to compare the unknown man's DNA with that of a potential granddaughter to determine if a familial match existed, leading to the exhumation being carried out on May 19, 2021, when police reported that the remains were in reasonable condition and expressed optimism regarding the possibility of DNA recovery, noting that the body had been buried deeper than previously thought. and that the exhumation formed part of Operation Persevere and Operation Persist, initiatives investigating historical unidentified remains in South Australia, with authorities emphasizing that if possible, DNA would be taken from the remains to aid identification. While in Coxon, Assistant Director of Operations at Forensic Science South Australia, stated that the technology now available for DNA analysis was light years ahead of the techniques available when this body was discovered in the late 1940s, and that every method at their disposal would be employed to attempt to bring closure to this enduring and enigmatic case that had puzzled investigators and captured the public's imagination for more than 70 years. In March 2009, a University of Adelaide research team, led by Derek Abbott, initiated a focused investigation into the Somerton Man case, aiming both to crack the mysterious code found in the back of the Rubaiyat and to support a proposal to exhume the body for DNA testing, with Abbott's work challenging several long-held assumptions made by police during the initial investigations and raising new questions about the case, while his team also traced the barber wax cotton used to repair the dead man's trousers, identifying variations in packaging that could provide clues as to the country where the material had been purchased, and through careful analysis of the code, they determined that the letter frequency differed significantly from what would be expected in random text, prompting further study into whether factors such as the alcohol consumption of the writer might alter the distribution, and they observed that the code's format appeared to mirror the quatrain structure of the Rubaiyat itself, leading them to hypothesize that it might represent a one-time pad encryption method, with comparisons being made across different texts, including copies of the Rubaiyat, the Talmud, and the Bible, using computer algorithms to generate statistical bases for letter frequencies. Yet the short length of the code meant that success would require identifying the exact edition of the book used, which had been lost in the 1950s, prompting researchers to seek out a Fitzgerald edition from that period. And after extensive analysis, the team ultimately concluded that the most plausible explanation was that each letter in the code represented the first letter of a word, providing a tantalizing but still unresolved lead in the decades-long mystery. Investigations into the Somerton Man case have been complicated by the fact that the original autopsy reports from 1948 and 1949 are now missing, and the Bar Smith Library's collection of Cleland's notes contains no material on the case. While anatomical analysis has provided some intriguing leads, Mache Henneberg, professor of anatomy at the University of Adelaide, examined images of the Somerton man's ears and found that his Simba, the upper ear hollow, is larger than his cavum, a trait found in only 1 to 2% of the Caucasian population. And in May 2009, Derek Abbott consulted with dental experts who determined that the Somerton man had hypodontia of both lateral incisors, a rare genetic disorder occurring in about 2% of the general population. Remarkably, in June 2010, Abbott obtained a photograph of Jessica Thompson's eldest son, Robin, which showed that he, like the unknown man, had both the unusually large Simba and hypodontia, with the odds of this combination being a coincidence estimated between 1 in 10 million and 1 in 20 million, fueling speculation in the media that Robin, who was 16 months old in 1948 and died in 2009, may have been the biological child of either Alf Boxall or the Somerton man, and subsequently passed off as the son of Prosper Thompson. While Abbott has argued that exhumation and autosomal DNA testing could conclusively link the Somerton man to a short list of surnames, and when combined with the other existing clues to his identity, provide what he describes as the final piece of the puzzle in one of Australia's most enduring and mysterious cold cases. After learning of Robin Thompson's death in 2009, Derek Abbott reached out to Rachel, the daughter of Roma Egan and Robin Thompson, who had been adopted and raised in New Zealand. And in 2010, Abbott and Rachel married, eventually having 3 children together, with the family keeping a painting of the Somerton man in their home, reflecting their belief that he was part of their family lineage. Although DNA analysis of Rachel later revealed links only to the grandparents of Prosper Thompson rather than the Somerton man himself, highlighting the complex and uncertain family connection surrounding the case. while in July 2013 Abbott commissioned and released an artistic impression of the Somerton Man in the hope that it might finally lead to identification, noting that relying on the decades-old autopsy photographs made it difficult to accurately visualize his appearance. And in December 2017, Abbott announced that 3 hairs in an optimal developmental stage for DNA extraction had been located on the plaster cast of the corpse and submitted for analysis at the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide, with processing expected to take up to a year, and despite significant degradation of the DNA, by February 2018, the University of Adelaide team successfully obtained a high-definition mitochondrial DNA analysis from the hair, revealing that the Somerton Man belonged to haplogroup H4A1A1A, a rare lineage present in only about 1% of Europeans. Although because mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively along the maternal line, it could not be used to establish a hereditary link between Rachel Egan, Abbott's wife, and the Somerton Man, leaving his precise identity unresolved but providing a crucial genetic insight into his uncommon maternal ancestry and offering a significant step forward in the decades-long quest to finally solve one of Australia's most enigmatic and enduring mysteries. On July 26, 2022, Derek Abbott announced that, working with genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, they had identified the long mysterious Somerton Man as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born on November 16, 1905 in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne, claiming that DNA extracted from strands of hair preserved in the plaster death mask made by South Australian police in the late 1940s had been used to confirm the identification through investigative genetic genealogy, which produced matches with descendants of 2 distant cousins of Webb, one from his paternal line and one from his maternal line, though by the time of this breakthrough, none of Webb's living relatives had known him personally. Initially, no pre-death photographs of Webb were known, but an independent researcher uncovered a 1921 photograph of a Swinburne Technical College football team showing a C-Webb. And later, in November 2022, Australian Story revealed photographs of Webb from the 1920s, found in a family photo album. While the ABC previously published photos of Webb's brother, Roy Webb, noting a resemblance to the Somerton Man, and Abbott and Fitzpatrick believe that Webb struggled with serious mental health issues and spiraled down after losing 4 close relatives in 7 years, with his personal history combined with the autopsy findings suggesting he died by suicide via poisoning. Though Forensic Science South Australia, still investigating, declined to comment on Abbott's findings, and the South Australia Police, while not yet verifying the result, expressed cautious optimism that this identification might finally provide a long-sought breakthrough in one of Australia's most enduring and enigmatic cold cases. Carl Charles Webb was born on November 16, 1905 in Footscray, a suburb of Melbourne, as the youngest of 6 children to Richard August Webb, who had emigrated from Hamburg, Germany, and Eliza Amelia Morris Grace, who married in 1892. The family ran a bakery in Springvale, Victoria, where 3 of the sons eventually worked, but after the bakery closed, Carl retrained as an electrical instrument maker, while his older brother, Roy Webb, died in 1943 in Burma as a prisoner of war forced to work on the Thailand-Burma Railway, and his oldest sister, Frida Grace Keane, had a son, John, who also died in 1943 serving with the RAF in the United Kingdom, marking a series of tragic family losses that would later contextualize Carl's own struggles. And on October 4th, 1941, Carl married Dorothy Doff Robertson, a pharmacist and chiropodist, and the couple moved into a flat on Bromby Street, South Yarra, though the marriage was reportedly strained due to Carl's solitary nature, limited social circle, and quiet habits, going to bed by 7 p.m. most nights, yet exhibiting moods of violence and threat when frustrated, even over minor matters, while being fond of poetry, particularly focused on death, which he described as his greatest desire, a predilection consistent with the thematic choice of Rubaiyat found with him. And Abbott's research suggests that Webb also enjoyed horse betting, leaving open the possibility that any coded messages in the Rubaiyat may have related to horse names. Intertwining his personal life, psychological disposition, and interests with the enduring mystery of his death. Dorothy Webb later revealed that in March 1946, Carl Webb had attempted to take his own life with an overdose of ether, an episode after which she nursed him back to health, only to be scolded and face increased violence from him. And by September 1946, she fled from him due to years of physical and verbal abuse. Webb had moved out in 1947, after which no official records traced his movements, though family members mentioned he may have relocated to Cotslow in Perth, losing contact thereafter. While by 1951 Dorothy was reportedly living in Butte, South Australia, roughly 144 kilometers from Adelaide, leading Abbott to speculate that Webb may have traveled to Adelaide intending to locate her, and she formally applied for a divorce citing desertion on June 5, 1951, with the hearing held on October 29th and the divorce granted in April 1952. Additionally, Webb's brother-in-law, John Keane, owned possessions suggesting travel to the United States, including coins and a map of Chicago, possibly linked to aircrew training in Canada en route to the UK. And since Keane lived just a 20-minute drive from Webb, this may explain why the Somerton man was found wearing American-style clothing bearing the name Keane, while on January 4th, 2022, former Adelaide lawyer Sophie Halsman proposed an alternative identification of the Somerton man as Austrian milliner Karl or Charles Joseph Alban, illustrating the ongoing mystery and multiple theories surrounding the man's true identity. Case 2, let me explain Theodore Robert Cowell, who would later become infamously known as Ted Bundy, entered the world on November 24, 1946 at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, born to Eleanor Louise Cowell. The identity of his biological father has remained shrouded in uncertainty for decades. While his original birth certificate seemed to attribute paternity to a salesman and United States Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, a copy of the document listed his father as unknown, adding to the mystery surrounding his early life. Louise herself claimed that she had encountered a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her shortly after learning of her pregnancy. Her younger sister, Audrey, remembered Worthington as a nice, reputable person who nonetheless refused to fulfill any financial responsibilities toward the child. Census records from the period indicate that multiple men by the names of John Worthington and Lloyd Marshall live in proximity to Louise at the time Bundy was conceived, and whispers within the family suggested more disturbing possibilities, including speculation that Theodore might have been fathered by Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell. However, these rumors were later dispelled when psychiatrist Dorothy Otno-Lewis, in the 2020 documentary Crazy, Not Insane, revealed that a DNA test conducted on a sample of Bundy's blood confirmed he was not the product of incest. During the first 3 years of his life, Bundy was raised in the Rockford neighborhood of Philadelphia by his maternal grandparents, Samuel Kenneth Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet, who took on the role of his parents to shield both him and Louise from the social stigma associated with childbirth outside of marriage in that era. To maintain this facade, family, friends, and even young Bundy were told that his grandparents were his parents, while his mother was presented to him as his older sister. As he grew older, Bundy eventually uncovered the truth about his origins, although accounts of how he learned varied. In one recollection, he told a girlfriend that a cousin had called him a bastard and shown him a copy of his birth certificate, while in interviews with biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, he claimed that he had discovered the certificate himself, slowly piecing together the hidden layers of his early life. According to biographer and true crime writer and Rule, who knew Ted Bundy personally, he did not uncover the truth about his parentage until 1969, when he finally located his original birth record in Vermont. This revelation ignited a deep and lasting resentment toward his mother, whom he felt had abandoned him to uncover the painful truth on his own, never offering guidance or explanation about his real father. Despite this, in several interviews, Bundy spoke with warmth about his grandparents, recounting to Rule that he identified with, respected, and clung to his grandfather Samuel, a figure who had been a central presence in his early life. Yet, as the years passed, a far darker portrait of Samuel emerged. By 1987, Bundy and other relatives had revealed to attorneys that Samuel was a tyrannical figure prone to violence and cruelty, beating his wife and even the family dog, swinging neighborhood cats by their tails, and displaying overtly racist and xenophobic attitudes. One particularly brutal incident involved Samuel throwing his own daughter Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping, a punishment both shocking and emblematic of his volatile temperament. He was also known to speak aloud to unseen presences, and on at least one occasion, he erupted in a violent rage when confronted with questions about Bundy's paternity. Bundy's grandmother, Eleanor, presented a stark contrast to her husband, appearing timid, submissive, and often fearful. She struggled with severe depression and periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy, retreating more and more into her home in her later years, too afraid to venture outside. A silent witness to her husband's cruelty and the complicated, often unsettling family dynamics that shaped Bundy's formative years. More recent investigations have called into question the darker portrayals of Bundy's grandparents, particularly his grandfather Samuel. Some longtime residents of Roxborough remembered Samuel as a fine man and were puzzled by the allegations of violence, animal abuse, and alcoholism. One of Bundy's cousins suggested that such descriptions have been exaggerated or even conveniently constructed to provide explanations for Ted's later behavior, insisting that, from their personal experience, Samuel had been a caring father whose daughters held only fond memories of him. Similarly, Louise's younger sister Audrey Cowell disputed claims that their mother had been mentally ill or unable to leave the house, explaining that her mobility was limited after suffering a stroke due to her weight. In 1950, Louise legally changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and following the encouragement of multiple family members, she moved with her young son to Tacoma, Washington, to live with her cousins Alan and Jane Scott. The following year, she met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church, and they married later that same year, with Johnny formally adopting Theodore. Louise and Johnny would go on to have 4 children together, and though Johnny made efforts to include his adopted son in family activities such as camping trips, Bundy remained emotionally distant from him. He would later express frustration to a girlfriend, describing Johnny as not his real father, not very bright, and someone who didn't make much money, revealing the early seeds of resentment and alienation that would continue to shape his complex relationship with father figures throughout his life. From a young age, Ted Bundy displayed deeply disturbing behavior that foreshadowed the dark path he would later follow. Louise's youngest sister, Julia Cowell, recalled a chilling memory of waking from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, with 3-year-old Bundy standing at the edge of the bed, smiling, an image that haunted the family for years. Sandy Holt, a childhood neighbor in Tacoma, remembered Bundy as a mean-spirited child who took pleasure in inflicting pain, fear, and suffering on others. Holt recounted particularly harrowing episodes of animal cruelty, including one incident in which Bundy allegedly hung a stray cat from a backyard clothesline and set it on fire with lighter fluid. According to her, he would also lure younger children from the neighborhood into the woods, force them to strip, and terrorize them, with their screams echoing through the neighborhood for blocks. Bundy reportedly went so far as to construct makeshift punji traps around his Tacoma neighborhood, causing injury to at least one girl. In later years, Bundy's recollections of Tacoma varied, depending on the audience. When speaking to biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, he described scavenging through trash barrels in search of photographs of naked women. To attorney and author Polly Nelson, he admitted to poring over detective magazines and crime novels, particularly drawn to stories involving sexual violence and images of dead or mutilated women. Yet in a letter to and Rule, he claimed that he never, ever read fact detective magazines and recoiled at the thought that anyone would. Bundy also confessed to Michaud that he would consume large amounts of alcohol and roam the community late at night, canvassing neighborhoods in search of undraped windows, where he could observe women undressing, or, as he put it, whatever else could be seen, revealing the early emergence of voyeuristic and predatory tendencies that would later define his criminal behavior. Psychologist Al Carlisle observed that Bundy began developing elaborate fantasies from an early age, often imagining women he saw while peering into windows and mimicking the accents of politicians he heard on the radio, as if trying to become someone else, someone important, a version of himself elevated above the ordinary world around him. Bundy's social life during adolescence was inconsistent and complex. He admitted to biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth that he often chose to be alone because he struggled to understand interpersonal relationships and lacked a natural instinct for forming friendships, claiming, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what underlay social interactions." Some peers perceived him as shy and introverted. He rarely participated in dances or social outings like beer-drinking gatherings, and while he was not a social outcast, he maintained a distinct emotional distance from his classmates. During his time at Hunt Junior High School, he endured relentless teasing, including incidents where classmates poured cold water on him while he showered in privacy, shunning the open communal showers used by others. Yet by the time he attended Woodrow Wilson High School, accounts from and rules suggest that Bundy was well known and well liked. Occupying a middling position in the social hierarchy of a large school, neither isolated nor dominant. His main physical pursuit was downhill skiing, a hobby he enjoyed intensely, sometimes using stolen equipment and forged lift tickets to facilitate his excursions. Despite outward appearances of normalcy, Bundy's adolescence included brushes with the law. He was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft, though the details were eventually expunged from his record at age 18, as was common in Washington and many other states, leaving a quiet but persistent record of early transgression beneath his otherwise conventional teenage life. After graduating from high school in 1965, Ted Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound for a year before transferring to the University of Washington to pursue studies in Chinese, a field that reflected his early interest in languages and foreign cultures. By 1967, he had become romantically involved with a fellow student, Diane Edwards, often referred to in biographies by pseudonyms such as Stephanie Brooks, whom Bundy later described as the only woman he had ever truly loved. In the early months of 1968, he abruptly dropped out of college and moved through a series of minimum wage jobs, while simultaneously immersing himself in political activity, volunteering at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign, and serving as driver and bodyguard for Arthur Fletcher during Fletcher's run for lieutenant governor of Washington state. That spring, Edwards graduated and left Washington for San Francisco, though Bundy followed her later that year after receiving a scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford University over the summer. In August, he attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami, an experience that placed him amid a turbulent and highly charged political atmosphere. Shortly afterward, Edwards ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California, citing Bundy's immaturity and apparent lack of ambition as reasons for their separation. Psychologist Dorothy Otno-Lewis later identified this rupture as a critical turning point in Bundy's psychological development, marking what she believed was a pivotal moment in the shaping of his emotional and social trajectory during these formative years. Devastated by the breakup, Bundy wandered across the country, first to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia before enrolling for a semester at Temple University. During this period, he often traveled to New York City, drawn irresistibly to pornography, losing himself in violent and graphic literature as he grappled with the pain of his failed relationship. Around this time, according to Rule, Bundy also uncovered the truth about his parentage in Vermont, a revelation that would quietly shape his sense of identity. In the fall of 1969, he returned to Washington, where he met Elizabeth Klopfer, known in Bundy circles by aliases such as Meg Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, working as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Their turbulent relationship would stretch far beyond his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. Bundy assumed the role of a father figure to Klopfer's young daughter Molly, who was 3 when their relationship began, remaining a presence in her life until she was 10 by which time he had been arrested. Later, as an adult, Molly recounted disturbing episodes that began when she was 7, describing times when Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate, including hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her in danger of drowning, indecent exposure, and sexual touching, often disguised as accidents or games, leaving an indelible mark of fear and trauma that would haunt her long after his capture. By mid-1970, Bundy, now focused and seemingly goal-oriented, re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time majoring in psychology. He quickly distinguished himself as an honor student, earning the respect of his professors for his intelligence and apparent diligence. In 1971, he took a position at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and worked alongside Rule, a former Seattle police officer, an aspiring crime writer who would later chronicle his life in The Stranger Beside Me. At the time, Rule saw nothing unsettling in Bundy's demeanor, recalling him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. After graduating in 1972, Bundy entered the political sphere, joining Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans's opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, recording stump speeches for analysis by Evans's team. Impressed by his work, Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. Following Evans's successful re-election, Bundy secured a position as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, who admired Bundy's intellect, drive, and apparent faith in the system. In early 1973, despite lackluster LSAT scores, Bundy gained acceptance to the law schools at the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah, bolstered by glowing letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several of his UW psychology professors. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Diane Edwards, who was struck by his apparent transformation into a serious, ambitious professional seemingly poised for a prominent legal and political future. Meanwhile, he continued to see Elizabeth Klopfer, with neither woman aware of the other's existence. That fall, Bundy enrolled at UPS Law School, all the while courting Edwards, who traveled to Seattle several times to be with him. They spoke of marriage, and at one point, he even introduced her to Ross Davis as his fiancée. But in January 1974, Bundy abruptly cut off all contact with Edwards, ignoring her calls and letters. When she finally reached him by phone a month later and demanded an explanation, he replied in a flat, emotionless tone, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up, never to speak to her again. Bundy later claimed he had merely wanted to prove he could have married her. But Edwards, looking back, concluded that his intense courtship had been deliberately orchestrated, a calculated reversal of the rejection he had once felt from her. By that time, Bundy had begun skipping law school classes, and by April, he had abandoned them entirely, as young women began vanishing across the Pacific Northwest, marking the ominous start of a string of disappearances that would soon cast a shadow over the region. There is no clear consensus on when or where Bundy began killing women, as he offered different accounts to different people and consistently refused to reveal the details of his earliest crimes, even while confessing in chilling detail to dozens of later murders in the days before his execution. He told Nelson that his first kidnapping attempt occurred in Ocean City, New Jersey, in 1969, though he claimed he did not actually kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. To psychologist Art Norman, he admitted killing 2 women in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philadelphia that same year. Bundy also hinted to homicide detective Robert D. Keppel that he had committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another involving a hitchhiker near Tumwater in 1973, yet he offered no further details. Both Rule and Keppel suspected that his killings may have begun in his teenage years. The first documented homicides attributed to Bundy occurred in 1974, when he was 27, by which point he had perfected the methods that allowed him, long before DNA profiling existed, to leave little or no forensic evidence at his crime scenes, demonstrating a chilling combination of cunning, calculation, and cold detachment, shortly after midnight on January 4th. 1974, around the time Bundy had ended his relationship with Diane Edwards, he broke into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a dancer and student at the University of Washington in Seattle's University District. Sparks, identified in Bundy literature under various aliases such as Joni Lenz, Mary Adams, and Terry Caldwell, was viciously attacked with a metal rod from her bed frame. Bundy bludgeoned her and then sexually assaulted her with the same weapon, inflicting severe internal injuries, including a ruptured bladder. Sparks survived but remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, suffering permanent brain damage and significant loss of both vision and hearing. Less than a month later, in the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda and Healy, a University of Washington undergraduate who delivered morning weather reports for local skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots, and carried her away. He later admitted that he drove Healy to a secluded location, where he raped and murdered her before leaving her body behind, marking one of the earliest documented homicides in his escalating spree across the Pacific Northwest. During the first half of 1974, young female college students began disappearing across the Pacific Northwest at an alarming rate, roughly one per month. On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus and never arrived. Bundy later claimed that in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness, he burned Manson's skull in his girlfriend's fireplace down to the last ash. Just over a month later, on April 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt vanished while returning to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles southeast of Seattle. Two female students from the same campus later reported encounters with a man wearing a sling, asking for help carrying books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance and the other 3 nights earlier. On May 6th, 22-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 260 miles south of Seattle, to meet friends for coffee, but never arrived. Bundy later admitted that he had persuaded Parks to go with him to a bar, then tied and gagged her, driving her back to Washington, raping her twice along the way before murdering her. On June 1st, Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. Bundy later claimed they had a consensual encounter at his residence before he strangled her in her sleep, though this failed to account for the extensive damage to her skull. As these disappearances continued, investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly alarmed. Physical evidence remained minimal, and the only clear link between the victims was their strikingly similar appearance. Young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the early hours of June 11, 1974, 18-year-old University of Washington student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking through a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory and her sorority house. The following morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist meticulously combed the alley on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Bundy later confessed to homicide detective Robert Keppel that he had lured Hawkins to his car, rendered her unconscious with a crowbar, handcuffed her, and driven her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. Demonstrating an almost incomprehensible audacity, the next afternoon, he returned to the very alley in the midst of an active crime scene investigation, quietly retrieving Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes from the adjoining parking lot before leaving unnoticed. It was a feat so brazen, Keppel later wrote, that it astonishes police even today. Bundy claimed that he revisited Hawkins' corpse on 3 separate occasions, further underscoring the calculated and chilling nature of his crimes. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses began coming forward, recalling a man on crutches with a leg cast, carrying a briefcase, wandering the alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night she vanished. One woman remembered that he asked her to help carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this time, Bundy held a position in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he even authored a pamphlet advising women on rape prevention. Later, he took a role at the Department of Emergency Services, a state agency actively involved in the search for the missing women, blending seamlessly into the investigation. It was at the DES that he met Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of two, and began a relationship with her, one that would later play a pivotal role in the final phase of his life 6 years down the line, adding yet another layer to the disturbing contrast between his outwardly respectable persona and his secret life as a predator. News of the brutal attack on Karen Sparks, along with reports of the 6 missing women, dominated newspapers and television across Washington and Oregon, spreading fear throughout the region. Young women drastically curtailed hitchhiking, and public anxiety reached a peak as pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies. Yet investigators were severely hampered by the scarcity of physical evidence, and police carefully withheld the little information they had to avoid compromising the investigation. Observers began to notice disturbing patterns among the victims. All disappeared at night, often near active construction sites, and their vanishings clustered around midterm or final exam periods. Each had been wearing slacks or blue jeans at the time of their disappearance, and several witnesses reported seeing a man with a leg cast or sling driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle, linking the crimes in a chillingly consistent pattern that hinted at a single, calculating perpetrator operating in the shadows. The Washington and Oregon murders reached a horrifying climax on July 14, 1974, with the brazen daytime abductions of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. 4 female witnesses recalled an attractive young man dressed in a white tennis outfit, his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent that sounded Canadian or British. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked for help unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 women refused. One accompanied him briefly, saw there was no sailboat, and fled. 3 other witnesses watched as he approached 23-year-old Janice Anad, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, and saw her leave the beach with him. About 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslund, a student training to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to use the restroom and never returned. Bundy later told Michaud and FBI agent William Hagmeyer that I was still alive when he returned with Naslund and that he forced one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other, though he later denied this in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. Armed with a detailed description of the suspect and his vehicle, King County Police plastered flyers throughout the Seattle area, while a composite sketch appeared in regional newspapers and on local television. Elizabeth Klopfer and Rule, a Department of Emergency Services employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, reporting Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives, inundated with up to 200 tips per day, found it hard to believe that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be capable of such crimes. On September 6, 1974, 2 grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Janice Ann Ott and Denise Marie Naslund near a service road in Issaquah, just 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. Among the remains were an extra femur and several vertebrae, later identified by Bundy as belonging to George Ann Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Linda and Healy, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks, and Brenda Carroll Ball on Taylor Mountain, a hiking spot Bundy frequently visited east of Issaquah. Donna Gail Manson's remains were never recovered. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance to the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Elizabeth Klopfer in Seattle. Though he called her often, he continued dating at least a dozen other women. As he began the first-year law curriculum for the second time, Bundy was dismayed to find himself outmatched intellectually by his peers, struggling to comprehend the material. "It was a great disappointment to me," he later admitted. By the following month, a new string of homicides began across Utah, Idaho, and Colorado, including 2 murders that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution, marking the continuation of his murderous spree beyond the Pacific Northwest. On September 2nd, 1974, Bundy raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, returning the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse before disposing of the remains in a nearby river. A month later, on October 2nd, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Bundy later confessed that Wilcox had been walking along a poorly lit main roadway when he forced her into an orchard at knife point, restrained her, and drove her back to his apartment, where she remained for 24 hours. He told investigators that her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles south of Holiday, though they were never recovered. On October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor around 9:30 p.m. Her nude body was found 9 days later in a nearby mountainous area, with post-mortem evidence suggesting she may have survived for up to a week following her disappearance. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 31st, 17-year-old Laura and Am vanished 25 miles south of Lehigh after leaving a Halloween party alone, last seen attempting to hitchhike. Her nude body was discovered by hikers 9 miles northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day, with the medical examiner estimating her death around November 20th, 20 days after her disappearance. Both Smith and Am had been brutally beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy would describe post-mortem rituals with their corpses, including shampooing their hair and applying makeup, revealing the chilling depths of his methodical and ritualized crimes. In the late afternoon of November 8, 1974, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol DeRanch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Melissa Ann Smith had last been seen. Claiming to be Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department, he told DeRanch that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to the station to file a report. When she noticed that the road he was driving on did not lead to the police station, Bundy abruptly pulled onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During the struggle, he accidentally fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, allowing DeRanch to escape by opening the car door and fleeing. Later that evening, 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent, a student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theater production to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and a student reported seeing a stranger asking them to step outside to identify a car, while another student saw the same man pacing at the rear of the auditorium. The drama teacher noticed him again shortly before the end of the play. Investigators later found a key outside the auditorium that unlocked the handcuffs previously fastened to DeRanch's wrist. Bundy later admitted to abducting Kent, keeping her at his apartment for a day, and stated that she had been alive for part of that time. That same month, Elizabeth Klopfer, alarmed by reports of young women disappearing around Salt Lake City, called King County Police a second time, prompting Detective Randy Hergesheimer of the Major Crimes Division to interview her in detail. By late 1974, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, yet the Lake Sammamish witness considered most reliable by detectives failed to identify him in a photo lineup. In December, Elizabeth Klopfer called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office to repeat her suspicions, leading to Bundy's name being added to their list of suspects, though no credible forensic evidence yet tied him to the Utah murders. In January 1975, after completing his final exams, Bundy returned to Seattle and spent a week with Klopfer, who did not reveal that she had reported him to police 3 separate times. She later made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City that August. That same year, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward from Utah into Colorado. On January 12th, 23-year-old registered nurse Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her nude body was discovered a month later next to a dirt road outside the resort, bearing fatal blows to the head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear grooves on her skull, a slit left earlobe, and deep cuts from a sharp weapon. 2 months later, on March 15th, 26-year-old Vail ski instructor Julie Lyle Cunningham vanished while walking from her apartment to a dinner date. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached her on crutches, asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, and then clubbed and handcuffed her before sexually assaulting her at a secondary site near Rifle, 90 miles west of Vail. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains, continuing the cold and calculated pattern of his murderous spree. On April 6, 1975, 25-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction while riding her bicycle to her parents' home. Her bike and sandals were later found beneath a viaduct near a railroad bridge. Bundy later admitted that he had abducted Oliverson, killed her in his car near the Utah state line, and dumped her body in the Colorado River, an account corroborated by gas receipts placing him in the city that same day. A month later, on May 6th, Bundy parked outside Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City, and lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver into his vehicle after spotting her walking alone. He drove her to a nearby Holiday Inn hotel room, where he raped her and drowned her in the bathtub, later disposing of her body in the Snake River north of Pocatello. Bundy reportedly revealed intimate details about Lynette's life in his confession, demonstrating both his meticulous attention to his victims and his chilling detachment. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's former Washington State DES co-workers, including Carol and Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City, staying a week in his apartment. He spent another week in early June with Elizabeth Klopfer in Seattle, where they discussed marrying the following Christmas, though Klopfer never revealed her repeated reports to authorities in King County and Salt Lake County. Bundy concealed both his ongoing relationship with Boone and a concurrent romance with a University of Utah law student, known in various accounts as either Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer, maintaining a web of deception even as his murders continued unabated. On June 28, 1975, 15-year-old Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her murder would later become Bundy's final confession, recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Nancy Wilcox, Deborah Jean Kent, Julie Lyle Cunningham, Denise Lynn Oliverson, Lynette Dawn Culver, and Susan Curtis were never recovered. In August, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, though he remained inactive, ignored most church restrictions, and would later be excommunicated following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked about his religious preference after his arrest, he identified as Methodist, the faith of his childhood. Meanwhile, in Washington state, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree, which had ended as abruptly as it began. In an effort to manage the overwhelming mass of data, detectives employed the then innovative strategy of compiling a database using the King County payroll computer, a massive, primitive machine by contemporary standards, but the only one available to them. They inputted the extensive lists they had compiled, including classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and other leads, and queried the machine for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 appeared on 4 separate lists, and one of those names was Bundy. Detectives also manually created a list of their 100 best suspects, with Bundy again appearing at the top. He was literally at the forefront of their investigation when news arrived from Utah of his arrest, linking the Pacific Northwest murders to his escalating crimes further east. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested in Granger, a Salt Lake City suburb, by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward, who had observed Bundy cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours. When Bundy spotted the patrol car, he fled at high speed, drawing Hayward's attention to the unusual configuration of the vehicle, including the removal of the front passenger seat and its placement on the rear seats. A search of the car revealed a ski mask, a second mask made from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy offered casual explanations. The ski mask was for skiing, the handcuffs had been found in a dumpster, and the rest were ordinary household items. Detective Jerry Thompson, however, recalled a similar suspect and vehicle description from the DeRanch kidnapping in November 1974 and immediately connected Bundy's name to the earlier tips provided by Elizabeth Klopfer. A search of Bundy's apartment turned up a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn, the site of Karen Eileen Campbell's murder, and a brochure advertising the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Deborah Jean Kent had disappeared. Despite these chilling connections, police lacked sufficient evidence to detain him, and Bundy was released on his own recognizance. He later admitted that officers had missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after his release. Following the arrest, Salt Lake City police placed Bundy under 24-hour surveillance, while Thompson and 2 other detectives flew to Seattle to interview Klopfer. She revealed that in the year before Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered inexplicable objects in both her house and Bundy's apartment, including crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply company, and a meat cleaver that had never been used for cooking, all hinting at the disturbing double life Bundy had been leading while maintaining the guise of charming, respectable law student. Additional items discovered in Bundy's possession included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Perpetually in debt, Bundy had amassed most of his possessions through theft, and Klopfer suspected that nearly everything of value he owned had been stolen. When she confronted him over a new television and stereo, he threatened her, warning, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." Klopfer later recounted that Bundy became extremely agitated whenever she considered cutting her long, center-parted hair, and that she sometimes awoke in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He also kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed, claiming it was for protection. Detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer on any of the nights when the Pacific Northwest victims vanished, nor on the day Janice and Ott and Denise Marie Naslund were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Klopfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of the existence of Diane Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police immediately impounded the vehicle, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it, discovering hairs that matched samples obtained from Karen Eileen Campbell's body. Further analysis identified strands microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa and Smith and Carol DeRanch. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal noted that the presence of hair from 3 different victims who had never met one another in a single car was a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity, providing critical forensic evidence linking Bundy to his crimes that on October 2nd, 1975, detectives placed Bundy in a lineup, and Carol DeRanch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, while witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. Though there was insufficient evidence to connect him to Deborah Jean Kent, whose body had not yet been recovered, the evidence was more than enough to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DeRanch case. Bundy denied knowing DeRanch, but had no alibi. He was released on $15,000 bail paid by his parents and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Elizabeth Klopfer's house. Seattle police still lacked sufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under constant surveillance. Klopfer later recalled, "When Ted and I stepped down on the porch to go somewhere, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the 3 principal investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, for a groundbreaking information exchange with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. The meeting, later referred to as the Aspen Summit, left officials convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought. Yet they agreed that more concrete evidence would be required before any charges could be filed in connection with the string of killings. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the kidnapping of Carol DeRoche. Following the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found Bundy guilty of kidnapping and assault, and in June he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. By October, Bundy was discovered hiding in bushes in the prison yard with an escape kit containing road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, resulting in several weeks spent in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with the murder of Karen Eileen Campbell. After initially resisting, Bundy waived extradition and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, he was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. Bundy had elected to represent himself and was excused from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he requested access to the courthouse law library to research his case, and while shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped from the second story, injuring his right ankle on landing. Discarding an outer layer of clothing, he limped through Aspen as roadblocks were set up on the outskirts, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain, where near the summit he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle, beginning one of his most daring and infamous escape attempts. The following day, Bundy left the cabin and attempted to continue south toward Crested Butte, but quickly became disoriented in the dense forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly across the mountain, missing 2 trails that would have led him downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer at Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, stealing food and a ski parka. Yet instead of pressing south, he inexplicably retraced his steps north toward Aspen, evading roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Bundy stole a car near the edge of an Aspen golf course and drove back into town, where 2 police officers noticed his vehicle weaving and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. Inside the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Karen Campbell's body, maps Bundy had obtained as his own attorney, illustrating the meticulous planning behind his escape. Back in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal counsel to remain put. The case against him, already tenuous, continued to deteriorate as pre-trial motions consistently favored him and key pieces of evidence were ruled inadmissible. Legal observers later noted that a more rational defendant might have realized he had a strong chance of acquittal. With as little as a year and a half left to serve on the DeRoche conviction, persistence could have seen him free. Instead, Bundy meticulously assembled a new escape plan, obtaining a detailed floor plan of the jail, a hacksaw blade from fellow inmates, and $500 in smuggled cash, much of it provided by Carroll and Boone over a 6-month period. During the evenings, while other prisoners showered, he sought a roughly 1 square foot hole between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell ceiling. Having lost 35 pounds, Bundy was able to wriggle through and explore the crawl space above in the weeks that followed, all while multiple reports from an informative movement in the ceiling during the night went uninvestigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in Aspen, and he filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted his request, but the venue was set for Colorado Springs, a city where juries had historically shown hostility toward murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most jail staff on Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy staged an ingenious escape. He piled books and files on his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space, breaking through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife. Bundy changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet and simply walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, he drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the vehicle soon broke down in the mountains along Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east, for where he caught a bus to Denver and then boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the skeleton crew at the jail did not discover his escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later, by which time Bundy was already well on his way, free in Chicago. After escaping Colorado, Bundy traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was seen at a local tavern on January 2nd, 1978. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove south to Atlanta, Georgia, before boarding a bus that brought him to Tallahassee, Florida, on the morning of January 8th. He stayed one night in a hotel before renting a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. Bundy later claimed that he initially resolved to seek legitimate employment and avoid further criminal activity, reasoning that he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida indefinitely if he stayed under the radar. However, his attempt at a construction job was quickly abandoned when he was asked to provide identification, forcing him back into his old habits. He resumed shoplifting and stealing money and credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping carts at local grocery stores, marking the first signs of his return to predatory behavior after months on the RU in the early hours of January 15, 1978, just a week after his arrival in Tallahassee. Bundy forced his way into Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty lock. Beginning around 2:45 a.m., he bludgeoned 21-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Bowman with a piece of oak firewood while she slept, then garroted her with a nylon stocking. Moving through the house, he entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy, beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples, bit deeply in her left buttock, and sexually assaulted her using a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom, he attacked 21-year-old Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and leaving a deep laceration on her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, also 21, who suffered a concussion, a broken jaw, lost teeth, and a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the brutal assault, with Kleiner later attributing their survival to automobile headlights illuminating their room and frightening Bundy away before he could finish his rampage. Tallahassee detectives determined that Bundy's attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house had occurred in less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority, he broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and assaulted 21-year-old FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places, leaving her permanently deaf in her left ear and with lasting equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. Police found on Thomas's bed a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar in class and characteristics to Bundy's. On February 8th, he drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van and approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but retreated when her older brother confronted him. That same afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles west of Lake City, and the following morning at Lake City Junior High School, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse and never returned. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City, with forensic experts concluding that she had been sexually assaulted before her throat was cut and her genitals mutilated with a knife. On February 12, 1978, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola Police Officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check revealed that his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and attempted to run, prompting Lee to fire 2 warning shots before tackling him. The two struggled over the officer's gun before Lee finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle, Police found 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, a stolen television set, a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses, and plaid slacks later identified as the disguise used by Bundy when posing as Richard Burton Fire Department in Jacksonville. As Lee transported him to jail, unaware that he had just apprehended one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy remark, "I wish you had killed me." In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted Bundy on charges of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary for the Chi Omega killings and assaults. He stood trial in June 1979 in the Florida Circuit Court for Dade County before Judge Edward Coward, with the proceedings covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents, the first nationally televised murder trial in the United States. Despite 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy handled much of his own defense, sabotaging the effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, as Nelson later wrote, fixating on controlling the trial even while facing murder charges and a possible death sentence. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of Bundy's defense team, a pretrial plea bargain had been negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to the murders of Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors reportedly favored the deal, partly because the prospects of losing a trial were considered high. Bundy, however, saw the plea bargain not only as a way to avoid the death penalty, but also as a calculated maneuver. By entering a guilty plea, he could wait for evidence to deteriorate, witnesses to move, die, or retract their testimony, and later file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last moment, though, he refused the deal. It made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty, Minerva said. He just couldn't do it. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy near the house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving while clutching the murder weapon. Forensic evidence included bite mark impressions on Levy's left buttock, matched by odontologists Richard Suverin and Lowell Levine to castings of Bundy's teeth. The jury also heard details of Bundy's previous kidnapping of Carol DeRoche. After less than 7 hours of deliberation, they convicted him on July 24, 1979, of the murders of Bowman and Levy, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assault on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Coward imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. Bundy appealed his conviction and death sentence to the Supreme Court of Florida, which ultimately affirmed both. 6 months later, Bundy faced a second trial in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before finding him guilty, largely due to the testimony of an eyewitness who had seen him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Critical physical evidence included clothing fibers with a rare manufacturing defect discovered both in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when arrested. During the penalty phase, Bundy exploited an obscure Florida law stating that a marriage declaration in court before a judge constituted a legal marriage. While questioning Carol and Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near him, had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again appearing as a character witness, he proposed marriage, and she accepted, allowing him to declare in court that they were legally married. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced to death for the 3rd time, reportedly standing and shouting, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This death sentence will be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. Only Boone appeared in court to beg for mercy. On October 24, 1981, she gave birth to their daughter, Rose Bundy. Although conjugal visits were officially prohibited at Florida State Prison in Rayford, where Bundy was incarcerated, inmates were known to pool money to bribe guards, allowing intimate time with female visitors. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the onset of the lengthy appeals process, Bundy began a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, speaking mostly in the third person to shield himself from the stigma of confession, while for the first time divulging details of his crimes and thought processes. He recounted his career as a thief, confirming Klopfer's long-standing suspicions that he had shoplifted virtually everything of value he owned. "The big payoff for me," he explained, "was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and taken." He revealed that possession had been a driving motive for his sexual assaults and murders as well, with rape satisfying his need to totally possess his victims. Initially, he claimed he killed victims as a matter of expediency, to eliminate the possibility of being caught. But over time, murder became an adventure, and the ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of a life. And then, the physical possession of the remains. Bundy also confided in Special Agent William Hagmaier of the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, who was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction Bundy derived from killing. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence, Hagmaier related. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you too are forever one. And the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy described his early years as an amateur and impulsive killer before entering what he called his prime or predator phase around the time of Linda Healy's murder in 1974, implying that his homicidal activity likely began well before that year, though he never explicitly admitted as much. In July 1984, prison guards discovered 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Bundy's cell, and a steel bar in one of the windows had been completely sawed through at both the top and bottom and then glued back into place using a homemade soap-based adhesive, evidence of his ongoing attempts at escape. Several months later, he was moved to a different cell after guards found an unauthorized mirror, and shortly thereafter he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with. Another high-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr., in October of that year, Bundy contacted FBI agent Robert Keppel, offering his self-proclaimed expertise in serial killer psychology to aid the ongoing investigation in Washington of the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel, along with Green River Task Force Detective Dave Reichert, interviewed Bundy extensively, yet Ridgway remained at large for another 17 years. Keppel subsequently published a detailed account of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with Stephen Michaud on a further examination of the material, analyzing Bundy's insights and methods. In early 1986, an execution date of March 4th was set for Bundy on the Chi Omega convictions, though the United States Supreme Court issued a brief stay. The execution was quickly rescheduled, and in April, shortly after the new date of July 2nd was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Michaud the full range of his crimes as they believed them to be, providing chilling details of what he had done to some victims after their deaths. He revealed that he often revisited locations such as Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other secondary crime scenes multiple times, returning to lie with the bodies of his victims and committing sexual acts until putrefaction forced him to stop, demonstrating the extreme control and possession that had become central to his criminal compulsion. In some cases, Bundy drove for several hours each way and remained with his victims' bodies throughout the entire night. In Utah, he meticulously applied makeup to Melissa and Smith's lifeless face and repeatedly washed Laura and May's hair, explaining to FBI agent William Hagmaier, "If you've got time, they could be anything you want them to be." He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims using a hacksaw and stored at least one collection of severed heads, likely the 4 later discovered on Taylor Mountain, Rancourt, Parks, Ball, and Healy, in his apartment for a period before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours prior to the scheduled July 2nd, 1986 execution, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit issued an indefinite stay and remanded the Chi Omega case to the Southern District of Florida, citing legal issues, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and a flawed jury instruction during the penalty phase, which required the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty, issues that were ultimately never resolved. A new execution date of November 18th, 1986, was set for the Leach sentence, only for the 11th Circuit to stay it on November 17th. By mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling despite dissent from Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan Jr. within hours of that final denial. A firm execution date of January 24, 1989, was announced. Bundy's passage through the appeals courts had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved as fast as they could, and even prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers did not employ delaying tactics. Though the public seethed at the apparent delay in executing the archdemon, Ted Bundy was in fact on a fast track to death. With all avenues of appeal exhausted and no further incentive to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak openly with investigators. He confessed to Robert Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides for which he had long been the prime suspect. In addition, he described 3 previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon, though he refused to disclose their identities or whether he even knew them himself. Bundy admitted that he had left Donna Gail Manson's body on Taylor Mountain, but had burned her head in Carroll and Klopfer's fireplace. Reflecting on the Issaquah crime scene, where the remains of Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, and Georgianne Hawkins were discovered, Keppel remarked, "It was almost like he was just there, like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time." Nelson's impressions were similar. It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me, his manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments. Bundy also confessed to law enforcement in Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, admitting numerous additional homicides, including some previously unknown to authorities. He revealed that during his time in Utah, he often brought victims back to his apartment, where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines. However, a calculated strategy soon became evident. Bundy deliberately withheld many details in hopes of leveraging incomplete confessions to secure yet another stay of execution. Despite warnings from his appellate attorneys that this tactic would likely antagonize the courts, Bundy provided investigators with piecemeal information about certain murders. "There are other buried remains in Colorado," he admitted, but steadfastly refused to elaborate further, maintaining a chilling control over what he would reveal and when Bundy's new strategy, immediately dubbed by investigators as Ted's Bones for Time scheme, was a chilling extension of his manipulative tendencies. By offering piecemeal information about some of his victims' remains, he hoped to postpone his execution, playing on the court's desire to recover and identify the bodies. In practice, however, this tactic only hardened authorities' resolve to carry out the sentence on schedule. Very little new, detailed information emerged, and in cases where Bundy did provide specifics, searches yielded nothing. Colorado detective Matt Linville later interpreted this as a psychological conflict. Bundy was simultaneously motivated to delay his execution by disclosing information while also maintaining total possession. The singular control over the true resting places of his victims, as it became evident that no additional stays of execution would be granted. Bundy's remaining supporters sought the only remaining avenue: executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last purported love interest, appealed to the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement so that Bundy could reveal more information. All the families refused. The families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them. Rote and Rule and others documenting the case. They didn't need his confession. Governor Martinez made it equally clear that further delays would not be tolerated. "We are not going to have the system manipulated," he told reporters. For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. In the final months of his life, Bundy began speaking more openly with investigators, revealing the full extent of his crimes and thought processes, while speaking mostly in the third person to distance himself from the stigma of confession. He described his early thefts and the thrill of possessing what he took, explaining how this compulsion later extended to sexual assault and ultimately to murder, which became a means of total possession over his victims and their remains. He recounted revisiting crime scenes multiple times, lying with the bodies of his victims, and performing sexual acts until decomposition forced him to stop, sometimes traveling long distances to remain with the corpses for an entire night. Bundy admitted to decapitating several of his victims and storing heads in his apartment for a time before disposing of them. And he shared details of how he applied makeup and washed the hair of some victims to keep them in an idealized state. Throughout this period, he employed a strategy of revealing information piecemeal to investigators, seemingly hoping to delay his execution while retaining exclusive knowledge of the victims' final resting places, a tactic that authorities quickly recognized as manipulative and despicable. His longtime partner felt utterly betrayed by his admissions, moving away with their daughter and refusing his final phone call, while Bundy spoke to investigators about thoughts of suicide, demonstrating his desire to control his final moments. He refused his last meal and faced his execution calmly, delivering a final message to his attorney and minister expressing love to his family and friends, followed by phone calls to his mother in which he apologized for the grief he had caused. Outside the prison, revelers celebrated his death as he was executed in the electric chair, and after his cremation, his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location in the mountains. In accordance with his will, marking the end of a life defined by manipulation, violence, and the cold meticulousness of a serial killer who had terrorized multiple states over more than a decade. Bundy was an exceptionally organized and calculating predator who leveraged his extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures to evade detection for years, operating across large geographic areas and ultimately claiming at least 20 known victims before investigators realized that multiple jurisdictions were pursuing the same perpetrator. He favored blunt force trauma and strangulation, silent, easily improvised methods that required only common household items, and deliberately avoided firearms to eliminate noise and ballistic evidence. A meticulous planner and researcher, Bundy carefully scouted his surroundings to identify secure locations for abducting and disposing of victims, demonstrating remarkable skill in minimizing physical evidence. Throughout his years of denying guilt, no fingerprints or other incontrovertible forensic traces of Bundy were ever recovered at a crime scene, a fact he frequently cited to support his claims of innocence. Bundy's ability to evade law enforcement was amplified by his essentially generic, nondescript features and a remarkable chameleon-like capacity to alter his appearance. Witnesses often struggled to identify him from photographs, as he seemed to look different in almost every image. In person, his expressions could so dramatically change his appearance that observers sometimes questioned whether they were seeing the same individual, prompting one judge to describe him as really a changeling. Bundy exploited this advantage with subtle adjustments in hairstyle or facial hair, and he deliberately concealed his only distinctive mark, a dark mole on his neck, using high collars or turtleneck shirts. Even his Volkswagen Beetle added to the confusion, with witnesses giving widely varying descriptions of its color, from metallic to non-metallic, and from tan to bronze or light to dark brown, making it difficult for authorities to trace. The Bundy's modus operandi grew increasingly organized and sophisticated over time, reflecting the typical evolution seen in serial killers. Initially, he relied on late night, forcible entry and attacked sleeping victims with blunt instruments. As his methods developed, he became more deliberate in selecting victims and crime scenes. He often used ruses to lure women to his vehicle, where he had prepositioned weapons, commonly a crowbar, and sometimes feigned injury by wearing a plaster cast or sling, or by using crutches, requesting assistance to gain trust. Bundy's good looks and charisma were key tools in manipulating his victims and those around him, allowing him to blend into daily life while concealing his predatory nature. He sometimes posed as an authority figure, firefighter, or other seemingly trustworthy individual, drawing in women under the guise of needing help, a strategy described by Michaud as Ted lured females the way a lifeless silk flower can dupe a honeybee. Once Bundy had his victims near or inside his vehicle, he would quickly overpower and bludgeon them, then restrain them with handcuffs before transporting them to a pre-selected secondary location, often far from the abduction site. At these sites, his apartment in Utah, for example, he would rape them while employing ligature strangulation. Toward the end of his Florida spree, likely under the stress of being a fugitive, he reverted to attacking sleeping women indiscriminately. While he has often been described as a torturer and labeled a sadistic sociopath by biographers like in Rule, Bundy himself disputed this characterization, telling Michaud that he never deliberately inflicted pain for pleasure and went out of his way to minimize suffering. Nevertheless, he admitted to Hagmaier that he would sometimes pose his victims to mimic detective magazine covers, adding a ritualized, morbid aspect to his crimes to tee his secondary crime sites. Bundy routinely removed his victims' clothing, sometimes burning it, and, in at least one case, the murder of Julie Cunningham, disposing of it in a Goodwill collection bin. He claimed the ritualized undressing served both a psychological purpose and a practical one, reducing the risk of leaving trace evidence that could link him to the crime. Ironically, a manufacturing defect in fibers from his own clothing became a crucial link in the investigation of Kimberly Leach's murder. Bundy frequently revisited these secondary sites to engage in necrophilic acts and to groom or dress the bodies, occasionally leaving victims in clothing or with nail polish that their families had never seen. He also took Polaroid photographs of many of his victims, telling Hagmaier that careful documentation ensured he didn't forget the details of his crimes. Alcohol consumption was a necessary prelude for him. He told both Keppel and Michaud that he had to be extremely drunk to suppress his inhibitions and override the dominant personality he feared might prevent him from acting on his violent impulses. All of Bundy's known victims were white females, predominantly from middle-class backgrounds, with the vast majority between 15 and 25 years old, many being college students. He deliberately avoided approaching anyone he might have personally known, telling Klopfer shortly before his execution that he had purposely stayed away from her whenever he felt the compulsion of his violent impulses building. Biographer and Rule noted that most of his victims had long, straight hair parted in the middle, resembling his first serious girlfriend, Stephanie Edwards, whom he had later briefly become engaged to and then rejected. Rule suggested that Bundy's unresolved anger toward Edwards may have fueled his targeting of women who looked like her. Bundy, however, dismissed this theory in conversations with Hugh Ainsworth, insisting that his victims just fit the general criteria of being young and attractive, and that physical similarity was largely coincidental, though he acknowledged that youth and beauty were absolutely essential in his selection process. After Bundy's execution, Rule was struck by the number of intelligent and sensitive young women who reported feeling profoundly affected by his death. Many had corresponded with him, each believing herself to be his only one, and several even experienced nervous breakdowns when he died. Rule reflected that, even in death, Ted damaged women. They are grieving for a shadow man that never existed, emphasizing how his manipulative persona continued to harm long after his crimes ended. Bundy underwent numerous psychiatric evaluations with differing conclusions. Dorothy Otno Lewis, a psychiatry professor at NYU and expert on violent behavior, initially diagnosed him with bipolar disorder, though she revised her assessment multiple times. She also proposed the possibility of a multiple personality disorder, citing accounts from interviews and court testimony that a great-aunt described an episode in which Bundy seemed to turn into another, unrecognizable person, leaving her inexplicably afraid of her own nephew at a train station. Similarly, a Tallahassee prison official reported witnessing a transformation in Bundy, noting dramatic changes in his body, facial expression, and even perceiving an almost tangible odor, describing it as almost a complete change of personality. That was the day I was afraid of him. While experts struggled to pin down a precise diagnosis for Bundy, most evidence ruled out bipolar disorder or other psychoses and instead strongly indicated antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. He exhibited classic ASPD traits: a superficially charming and charismatic exterior with minimal genuine personality or insight, a clear understanding of right and wrong with almost no effect on his behavior, and a complete absence of guilt or remorse. He once remarked that guilt doesn't solve anything. Really, I am in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt. In addition, Bundy displayed narcissism, manipulativeness, and poor judgment. Evaluated using the psychopathy checklist, revised, he reportedly scored 39 out of 40, placing him at the extreme end of psychopathy. Prosecutor George Deacle described sociopaths as egotistical manipulators who think they can con anybody, and one psychiatrist admitted, "Sometimes he manipulates even me." Dorothy Otno Lewis ultimately concluded that Bundy may have been a true psychopath, entirely devoid of remorse or empathy, while later analyses suggested narcissistic personality disorder or malignant narcissism could also explain aspects of his behavior. On the afternoon before his execution, Bundy granted a videotaped interview to psychologist James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, during which he attributed the development of his violent sexual urges to gradual exposure to violent pornography, claiming that once one became addicted to such material, it shaped sexual fantasy and behavior in increasingly extreme ways. In these final statements, Bundy attempted to rationalize his crimes, discussing influences and personal experiences while still maintaining the same detached and manipulative demeanor that had characterized him throughout his life, offering insight into the mind of one of history's most infamous serial killers. Bundy claimed that his escalating violent urges were fueled by exposure to increasingly extreme pornography, saying he would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material, until one reached a point where fantasizing was no longer enough, and maybe actually doing it became the next step. He warned that sexualized violence in the media was pushing boys down the path to becoming serial killers like him, and even suggested that the FBI monitor adult movie theaters to prevent future offenders. While Nelson appeared to take his concerns seriously, most biographers, researchers, and observers have interpreted Bundy's condemnation of pornography as a final manipulative ploy designed to shift blame away from himself and onto societal influences, particularly Dobson's agenda as a longtime critic of pornography. He claimed that true crime magazines had fueled his fantasies. Yet in earlier correspondence and interviews, Bundy admitted he rarely read such material, and told Michaud, Ainsworth, and Hagmeyer that pornography played a minimal role in his development as a killer. Prosecutor George Deacle bluntly summarized, "The problem wasn't pornography. The problem was Bundy." And Rule concluded that the Dobson tape was just another example of Bundy's manipulation, an attempt to make the public bear responsibility for his crimes while diverting attention from his own culpability. Rule and Ainsworth observed that Bundy's worldview was one in which blame was always externalized. Someone or something else was responsible for his actions. Even though he ultimately confessed to 30 murders, he never truly accepted personal responsibility, not even when pretrial confession could have spared him the death penalty for the Chi Omega case. Instead, he attributed his crimes to a wide range of scapegoats: his allegedly abusive grandfather, the absence of his biological father, his mother's concealment of his true parentage, alcohol, the media, law enforcement whom he accused of planting evidence, society at large, television violence, and the influence of true crime magazines and pornography. He even blamed the very technology he stole, claiming television had brainwashed him into stealing credit cards. In one letter to Klopfer, he went so far as to imply that some victims themselves had invited abuse by displaying vulnerability or fear. Underlying this pattern of deflection was a pervasive delusion. Bundy saw himself as a product of circumstance rather than an agent of his own monstrous choices, rationalizing his actions through a distorted lens that absolved him of moral accountability. Bundy consistently seemed bewildered that anyone noticed his crimes at all, operating under a warped belief that people were largely invisible to each other and that the world existed only in relation to himself. He was astounded when witnesses placed him at crime scenes, unable to comprehend that others could observe or remember him. In conversations with psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis, he expressed confusion over why everyone is out to get me, revealing his profound lack of insight into the scale and gravity of his actions. Experts noted that long-term serial killers like Bundy construct immense psychological barriers to guilt, walls of denial so formidable they are rarely penetrable. Each time Bundy confessed, Nelson observed, it required him to surmount these deep-seated defenses, confronting truths he had meticulously buried within himself for years. Bundy confessed on the eve of his execution to 30 homicides, though the actual number of his victims remains unknown, as he often made cryptic remarks to encourage speculation. In 1980, he told Ainsworth that for every murder publicized, there could be another that was not. And when FBI agents suggested a total of 36, he replied, "Add one digit to that, and you'll have it." Later, he told Nelson that the commonly cited estimate of 35 was accurate, but profiler Robert Keppel believed the number was far higher, estimating at least 50 and possibly up to 75 victims. Bundy's own lawyer, John Henry Brown, recounted that Bundy had claimed his first victim was a young boy during a sexual game in the woods, suggesting he may have begun killing in early adolescence, and that he had killed over 100 people. Leon County Sheriff Kenneth Katsaris remembered Bundy, implying that whoever was apprehended for these crimes would be wanted for murders numbering in the 3 digits across 6 states. Even those close to him, including the Methodist minister who administered his last rites, felt that Bundy himself may not have fully known how many he had killed or why, highlighting the chilling and enigmatic scope of his crimes.